Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Arise with Sally Goodwin. It is so good to see you here today, this Thursday, and welcome to February 2021. Wow, can you believe it? It is an amazing time to be alive and really exciting to get to spend time with you all again. And so I have been asking God what I should share on. And you know that I love to do these kind of a few episodes of one sort of topic. And that's actually just how I didn't plan it like that. It sort of has worked out like that as I've listened to the Holy Spirit. And so I felt the Holy Spirit say to me that over this month of February, I need to share on the book of Esther because it is the feast of Purim. So it's when the Jewish people celebrate Esther, they celebrate Purim. And that whole story is all included in the book of Esther. And I kind of thought, Esther, we all know the story. We all quote the verse from Esther 4:14, and God was just like, no, he kept on, no, it needs to be Esther, it needs to be Esther. And so I started just going over the book of Esther with the Lord. And yeah, there is actually so much in it that we don't get to see. So over the next few weeks, apart from the one Thursday where we look at the Jewish calendar, at the episode for the next month of the Jewish calendar, we are going to be looking at the book of Esther and just looking at some of the prophetic messages that are encapsulated in the book of Esther that I think we miss often because we're so used to the story and we're so used to kind of, we've all heard the story. It's a story that we taught right from Sunday school, and I find that often those stories that we kind of learned, from so high in Sunday school are the ones that become so commonplace to us, and we're so used to them that we miss sometimes the detail and the revelation that God has for us contained within those stories. And it's just such an incredible privilege to be able to just go over it again and kind of learn from the Lord again, almost anew. So we're going to look at the book of Esther over the next few weeks, and just some interesting facts about the book of Esther in case you don't know these. But the book of Esther and the book of Ruth are the only two books in the whole entire Bible named after a woman. So very good reason to celebrate both of them. They're the only two books named after women. And Esther and Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon, are the only two books in the Bible that don't directly mention God. So every other book mentions God. They're the only two books that don't directly mention God. The interesting thing about the book of Esther is that even though God isn't mentioned directly, I mean, you see his hand right through the whole book, but in the Hebrew scriptures, in the Hebrew translation or the Hebrew writings of Esther, because when Esther was written, it wasn't, the Jews were persecuted, and I mean, the Jews have always been persecuted, but they weren't supposed to speak about God. They weren't supposed to mention. So what a lot of the Hebrew writers did in those days is they put acrostics. Now, we've spoken about that before when we looked at looking at the Hebrew alphabet. I explained how Psalm 119 is an acrostic and how King David used the whole of the Hebrew alphabet, through Psalm 119. Each verse or each section began with a new letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And in the book of Esther, the Hebrew scribe who wrote the book, who no one seems to know exactly who it was who wrote it, used acrostics to reference Yahweh. So there's some sections in the book of Esther and the Hebrew writings where if you look at the first letter of the verses, or how it was written out, it's actually an acrostic for Yahweh, and for various other of the Hebrew words that meant God, meant Lord. So even though God wasn't mentioned directly by name in the writings, he was definitely referenced the way that the Hebrew writers knew how to do back in those days. And then the book of Esther, along with Ezekiel and Daniel, were all written during the Jewish exile. And so all three of those books, Esther, Ezekiel, and Daniel, were actually set outside of the Promised Land. So it was during the Jewish exile that a lot of the Jews were in exile. Some of the Jews had been allowed to return to Jerusalem, but not all of them had, not all of them could, not all of them wanted to. And so those three books were actually set during the Jewish exile, and they occurred outside of the Promised Land. So those are just a few interesting facts about the book of Esther. And obviously, we don't have time in these episodes to read through the whole entire book, even though it's only 10 chapters. So I'm going to highlight verses that, that speak into what I'm wanting to bring across to you. But at the same time, I really encourage you to go and read the book of Esther and really ask the Holy Spirit to give you revelation on, from things within the book of Esther that you might have missed up until this point. But so we are looking at the first chapter in Esther, and it starts off in chapter 1 by saying that it was in the days of Ahasuerus or Xerxes, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. So that was in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which was in Shushan or Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire, in the palace or castle. So basically, in those days, from India to Ethiopia, that is a very large territory. And in those days, it was Persia, the Persian Empire. Nowadays, Shushan or Susa is modern day Iran. So now where Iran is now, that was where this story was set. And sometimes also I think that's a really good idea. We read these stories as historical, and they are obviously a historical representation of something that actually happened. But if you then actually place it within context of where that space is today, it almost adds another level or another layer to your understanding of what God is saying. Anyway, so we all know, I'm going to call him Xerxes because Ahasuerus is quite hard to pronounce over and over again. So we know the story that it was in the third year of his reign, and he decided to have this 180-day kind of celebration where he showed his riches and his majesty off to everyone around him. And after the 180 days, he then had a feast for all the people present in Shushan, which was the capital then of the Persian Empire, both great and small. So no matter who you were, it was a feast for everybody. And it was a 7-day feast in the court of the palace of the kings, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. And the whole thing obviously goes, describes, the beauty and the opulence of the palace and everything that went on while they had this whole feast. And then it speaks about that the queen of the day, or Xerxes' wife, his queen at the time, was Queen Vashti. Now, often I find that when we read or we talk about the book of Esther, because Vashti makes such a quick kind of an entrance and an exit right at the beginning, and because the book of Esther is very rightly focused on Esther, we don't pay a lot of attention to Vashti, and we don't kind of really, it's kind of, she was there and then she was gone, and and Esther took her place, and it was all for a reason. And absolutely, I agree with all of that. But there was something about Vashti that I just felt I just wanted to look a little bit more into who she was and what her story was, because she was the queen. The queen, the kings in those days, they had a wife who was the queen, and then a whole lot of concubines, sort of mistresses. So, but the queen was the above all the others. And also often, those days they didn't marry for love or anything. They married for political gain. Women were kind of given in marriage to kings or leaders for diplomatic pacts between countries and all that kind of thing. So we know sort of how she got into being Queen Vashti, although there's a little bit of confusion or disagreement as in terms of where she came from. Some people say that she was actually Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, that she came from the Babylonian, empire, but nobody seems to be 100% sure. But when I looked Vashti up and I just researched a little bit about who she was, again, there's a whole lot of different kind of stories about her. And I suppose it's a reminder as well that history is often, apart from what is in the Bible, which is probably why the Bible doesn't go into too much detail about all of those things. You know, history is very much written from the perspective of the people who are writing the history. You know, so when you read back over history, the context of whatever you're reading about is always going to be skewed towards the flavor or the belief system or whatever of whoever wrote that history. So depending on where you are when you read about Vashti or you research Vashti depends on the answers you get as to who she was and as to why she disobeyed King Xerxes. So we know that King Xerxes, on the 7th day of the 7-day feast, so they've now been feasting for 7 days, okay? When the king's heart was merry with wine, which, yeah, apparently, according to just things that I've read and researched, means that he was intoxicated, he commands his eunuchs to go and bring Queen Vashti before the king. This is Esther 1, verse 11 and 12. Bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, conveyed by the eunuchs. Therefore the king was enraged and his anger burned within him. Now, apparently, when he asked for Queen Vashti to come before him with her royal crown, the actual meaning of that is that she was supposed to come before him and all of his revered guests and kind of high-powered people just in her royal crown. In other words, naked. Now, obviously today that sounds completely, but in those days it was, women, weren't treated particularly well. And so this was something that so a lot of people say he told her to come before them naked and she refused because of that. But according to research, it wasn't that, because she actually had done it before. So it was something that was kind of expected of queens in those days. She was obviously beautiful and he wanted to show her off. So for all of this time, he'd been showing off all of his prized possessions and she was his final kind of most prized possession, and he now wanted to show her off, and she said no. So recently, over recent sort of years, as the feminism movement have taken a bit more ground, even in Jewish history, a lot of more kind of feministic or women with a very strong feminist leanings have started to actually applaud Vashti and almost not ignore Esther, but almost like, Esther was the subservient, obedient, and Vashti was the one who was like, no, I actually will not do what you say. She was like standing up for herself and standing up for all womankind. But I'm not so sure that that was the case, because it doesn't come out anywhere in all the history that I researched and all the articles I read. That didn't seem to be the case. It wasn't something that was done, even though in Persia, actually, women had quite a good status and they weren't as dominated as in other cultures. They could own land, they could have money and all of that sort of thing. The queen was still very much the king's possession. And so I don't know that she was taking a stand for feminism. Other articles I read said that the reason she wouldn't come before him was because she had suddenly come down with an unusual rash that covered her whole body. In fact, some people go so far as to say that it was almost a kind of leprosy. And so she was too vain to appear in front of all these people, not looking perfect, because this rash kind of made her obviously not feel perfect. And other articles that I've read have said that she was actually not a very nice person. The Jewish people were very much spread right throughout the whole kingdom of Persia because they were in exile there. And she had Jewish servants, Jewish maidservants. And apparently she used to make her Jewish maidservants perform their duties naked to humiliate them. So there are a few conflicting stories about Vashti. I think what I came away with from Vashti's whole thing was that whatever was behind it, God moved her out of the way so that Esther could be moved in. So I think what I'm trying to say is that it wasn't as though the king called her up to do something she'd never done before and she refused. That he called her up to do something that was commonplace or expected in that day, and she refused, which was not commonplace or expected in that day. And no one's quite sure why, exactly why she refused, but it wasn't something that was done then. So whether she did get some weird rash or almost a kind of a leprosy, whether that was from the Lord to actually move it, the Bible doesn't specifically say. But it is interesting to note that her moving out was actually an unusual situation or circumstance. Bearing in mind also that, once you'd been married to the king, once you'd been the queen or even a concubine and you'd lived in the harem, you were never allowed to be with another man. So even if the king never had anything to do with you ever again for the rest of your life, you had to stay there forever until you died. You were never allowed to marry again. You were never allowed to leave the palace. So if the king forgot about you and never saw you again, that was it. So some researchers say that happened to Vashti, that she just lived there forever. But other people say that she would have been killed because that kind of insubordination would not have been countenanced, and she would have been done away with quietly somewhere. And even her political, because even the queen stirred up political enemies when she was queen, her political enemies would have actually made sure that she kind of was taken out. So I don't know that she would have just refused because she didn't feel like it, knowing the possible consequences of her refusal. I just can't imagine that she would have said no. And King Xerxes apparently was A, a big drinker, and B, a man with a very short fuse. He got angry quickly. He got huge bad tempers, and he did all sorts of things when he was in a bad temper. So I don't know, and she must have known him. I mean, and she knew royal customs. She knew what was expected of her. So, the whole thing just, doesn't seem to me as cut and dried as, oh, well, he asked, she said no, so she left and Esther stepped in. There's a more of a divine hand behind that, if you ask me. I think that's what I got out of my research into Vashti. And then, of course, the king then asks, so he's now angry and he's obviously embarrassed, and all his people know that she disobeyed him and everything else. And then he asks, of course, all his trusted advisors and his eunuchs and everything else, and they're all men, clearly, what should be done. And they are the ones who come up with this, that she should be sent from his presence and never be seen again, because if all the other women in Persia hear about what she did, none of them will listen to their husbands. And I'm like, okay. And that pleased the king. He was happy with that. So that very day, he issued a decree, like basically rendering her persona non grata, and that she would be divorced and she would never come before him again, and that he was going to find another queen. And he even sent letters to all the royal provinces, to each person, to all the different people in their own language. And part of what he said in his letters, which was really taking this all to the nth degree, was that every man should rule in his own house and speak there in the language of his own people. In other words, if he had foreign wives, his foreign wives must learn his language. Patriarchal much? So this whole first chapter of Esther kind of, it was very much that patriarchal system in full force, but also just a kind of if you can see it, if you can look beyond some of that, and also just remember ancient times, context, etc., etc. It very much was like God was setting the stage for something. So, and they wouldn't have known it then. Esther didn't know it then. The Jewish people didn't know it then. But God knew something about what was going to happen in the future, but he also had some old, not scores to settle, but he had some old things that needed to be worked out and that needed to be redeemed. And he actually used this period of time and Esther and this period in the Jewish history to do exactly that. So he was behind the scenes, organizing things in such a way that the rest of the story would then follow on from here. And I think it's just proof that no matter what things look like in the natural, no matter how bad they look, no matter how just how shocking things seem, how shocking things are, how shocking it is that this is how people lived, and that this is a king could do this, and that this was part of kind of life back then. God knew, and God still was moving. And the Jewish people at this time were living in relative ignorance because they had no idea of what was going to happen in the future, of where, and we don't know whether if Queen Vashti had stayed queen, whether Haman would still have come up and tried to slaughter all the Jews. But we have to assume that that was going to happen, and Queen Vashti wouldn't have stepped in to save the Jewish people because she wasn't Jewish. And so Esther was needed to be put in that place. So the enemy had a plan, but God had an alternate plan. So just in the same way as God used Jesus, the enemy had a plan to bring about the downfall of the world, but God had an alternate plan, and his plan was in place already before he laid the foundations of the earth. So he needed Esther to be there to sort this all out. He needed to make sure that the Jewish people were looked after because he'd always said they would be. And even though, I think this is the other thing that I got out of all of this, even though they were in exile in a strange land, far from the promised land, far from Jerusalem, God, and even though I think they often felt like God had forgotten about them, and they often felt as though they'd been left out, in the cold kind of thing, this first chapter of Esther just proves that he hadn't. He was working. They didn't see he was working. They didn't know he was working. They didn't have any idea of what was actually going to come. But he was working. He was sorting this all out so that when the time came, when the enemy tried to put his plan into place, God's plan would actually be able to win, to take victory over that. So I think if you can read the first chapter of Esther and as a woman get beyond the patriarchy and the sheer indignation one feels as a woman for the fact that that's how women were treated, and that's the sort of thing that happened then. And I mean, we know that in some places not much has changed, and it might not be exactly the way it is written here, but there's still a lot of that around in the world. But I think if as women we can look past that and know that God is still moving, that even all of these things that kind of reduced women to nothing, it was a woman that God used to bring the Jews salvation. So, that didn't stop him from using a woman. It wasn't a man that he used. It wasn't, it wasn't an army. It wasn't, angelic warriors. It was nothing like that. It was a woman, a Jewish woman, that he used to bring salvation. So I would encourage you to read over that first chapter of Esther and just ask God to show you any place in your life where you are feeling as though he's not moving, and let him give you a sneak peek behind the scenes at what he's actually doing to set you up for victory, which is what the book of Esther is all about. And then get in touch with me. Let me know. All my contact details are on the screen. You can reach me in a number of ways. Let me know if God has shown you something. I would like to hear about it. And I will see you then next Thursday. And the reason I'm hesitating is because one of these Thursdays is a Jewish calendar Thursday. Anyway, the next Thursday, and we'll continue with the rest of the book of Esther. Love you lots. Bless you hugely. See you soon.